Prior to the creation and later enforcement of the Hays Code, the United States film industry went largely unregulated. By 1930, the Hays Code was created, but it wasn't enforced, and so from a period between 1930 to July of 1934, there was a period referred to as pre-code. And a lot of things that were on the Hays Code, such as the use of drugs and alcohol, discussions of sex and sex work, and other things that couldn't be explored or explored openly during the Hays Code were discussed. Some of these were of a lot bigger budget. You have films like The Divorcee, where divorce is a big subject. You also have Three on a Match and various gangster films. And so it was a very interesting period between the complete lack of regulation to really going against a code that was created by both the Catholic and Baptist Church as well as William H. Hays. Then July of 1934 comes in and Joseph Breen puts his foot down and begins to regulate Hollywood. This just meant that Hollywood was self-regulating and the United States government couldn't really come in, or was not supposed to come in, and make decisions for them. A big part of these decisions were made on behalf of the Catholic and Baptist Church, and really just religion as a whole. But Joseph Breen and his enforcement over the Hays Code and the power that he had over the studios as well as directors and writers and actors couldn't last forever. And by the 1950s, the Hays Code started to phase out, really being only a name by the 1960s. Eventually, the Hays Code was done with completely, and a new rating system was put into effect. And that is pretty much the rating system that we have today, though it has evolved since its original creation in 1968. In today's video, we will be discussing the phasing out of the Hays Code. This is the fourth episode in this series on film censorship and rating systems. Check out the playlist in the description box below, along with various resources if you are interested. Thank you for joining us, and let's get started. Hello, I'm Ainsley, and thank you for joining me today on the Quiet Riot, where we talk film, television, and media. I would like to welcome our new subscribers, and welcome to any new viewers. Welcome back to subscribers and any returning viewers. I thank you all for being here. I really do appreciate it. And this is the fourth episode in film censorship and rating systems. So if you haven't caught up on that already, go check those out in the description box below. I already did kind of a brief recap, but if you want a little bit more information on why the Hays Code was initially invented, so to speak, then you can find that out down there or in the censorship and rating systems playlist. In 1934, Hollywood experienced a big shift with the enforcement of the Hays Code. Under the watchful eye of Joseph Breen, the production code worked for over a decade, but it couldn't last forever. And with a competitive market, the Hays Code had less of a stronghold on the film industry. There were many things that led to the phasing out and eventual throwing out of the Hays Code altogether. What really started the phasing out of the Hays Code was the economic difficulties that the film industry was enduring. The economic difficulties that the industry was enduring were made worse by the result of the United States versus Paramount Inc. in 1948. This is when the Supreme Court outlawed vertical integration as it had been found to violate antitrust laws, and studios were not only forced to give up ownership of theaters, but they were also unable to control what exhibitors offered. This led way for foreign films to be distributed in the US. The Italian neorealism movement crossed the pond with Bicycle Thieves, premiering in the US in 1949. Films out of Italy and other countries became competition for the US film industry because they didn't play under the same rules as United States cinema. Eventually, studios began to find ways to comply with the code while also circumventing it. Columbia acquired Kingsley Productions, an art house distributor that specialized in distributing foreign films. Other studios followed suit. While Columbia's contract with the MPAA forbade it from distributing any film out of the Code Seal of Approval, the contract did not state what a subsidiary could or could not do. By the end of the 50s, all studios followed suit and began distributing foreign film. Along with Italian neorealism, films out of Sweden directed by Ingmar Bergman or other Swedish directors, as well as films out of France and elsewhere, were to be distributed by these subsidiaries. And so you had the Hays Code being followed, for the most part, by directors in the US, but then you had these studios that were also bringing in these foreign films. And so the foreign film market in the US began getting a lot larger and were being shown in a lot more studios or being shown in a lot more cinemas across the country. In 1950, only 9% of Americans had a television. But by the end of the decade, 85.9% of Americans had a television in their home. As the 50s progressed, more and more people in the US were purchasing televisions, and by the mid to late 50s, sitcoms such as Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver were bringing in large audiences. I Love Lucy was a popular series from its premiere in 1951, and old shorts were being introduced to newer audiences thanks to television. Before the 1950s, the film industry had little to no competition. The real only competition that they had at the industry's beginning was theater. But film had the upper hand because it was the new thing. But with the invention of television and more televisions being in the house of its American audience, more people were going home to watch TV with their families and gathering around the television instead of going out and spending money at the theater. Besides the Supreme Court's original ruling in 1948, there was some new problems for the Hays Code. It no longer had any legal backing. In 1952, the Supreme Court overruled its 1915 decision and granted films the right to free speech. The Miracle decision, as it became known, removed legal backing for the Hays Code. With no more legal backing, it became harder for the code to be enforced. By 1952, writers and directors began to directly challenge it. They released their films without the approval and were still able to find success. This led to more and more directors and writers pushing boundaries. Throughout the 50s, there were several directors that pushed the boundaries of the Hays Code. There were adaptations of Tennessee Williams' plays Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and Suddenly Last Summer, released in 58 and 59 respectively, pushed the boundaries of sexuality. Otto Preminger often broke the rules, and Billy Wilder weakened the authority of the Hays Code. Miss Lemon is sleeping on the job at the moment, so you may hear some of her little snores and grunts and all that. In the 1950s, Otto Preminger began making films that were at the time taboo in Hollywood. His films dealt with drug addiction, as seen in Man with the Golden Arm, released in 1958, rape, Anatomy of a Murder, released in 1959, and homosexuality in Advice and Consent, released in 1962. In 1953, the Catholic Legion of Decency condemned the comedy The Moon is Blue on the grounds of moral standards. The film was based on a Broadway play which had inspired mass protests for its use of the words virgin and pregnant. Otto Preminger refused to remove the offending words. Preminger had the film released without the production code seal of approval. And the film can actually be found here on YouTube. I will link it in the description box below. And it's really weird watching some of these films that were made in the 1950s and were considered to be handling very taboo subjects, especially when it came to films that would be made maybe 10, 20 years later, especially films that are made today. They're not taboo to us now. So it's weird to think that these are the films that are challenging the status quo at the time. In 1959, Billy Wilder would refuse to make changes to his film Some Like It Hot. He released the film without the code's seal of approval. It was a critical and financial success, further breaking down a code that was already on its way out. Wilder's previous work, including quintessential film noir Double Indemnity, challenged the Hays Code. The noir style and subject matter often associated with noir pushed the boundaries from its creation in 1940 through 1955. Wilder, Preminger, and other directors known for noir played a part in challenging and later dismantling the code entirely. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock made and released Psycho independently. Based on the novel of the same name, Psycho wasn't quite as brutal as its subject matter, but it was brutal for the period and showed various things that were often taboo at the time and weren't often showed in film in the 50s. Because of the film's success, Psycho is widely considered to be the film that signaled the end of the Hays Code. Showing the toilet, a stabbing scene, blood, and sympathizing with the killer were four things that led to the end of an era, also known as the Hays Code. I have a video where I discuss Psycho and how it is a precursor to the slasher film that, along with the film Peeping Tom, also released in 1960, are often considered the first slasher films, with Peeping Tom predating it by a month or so. And you have Psycho that really does follow this very slasher-esque formula, and you can see how Psycho is a big inspiration to other popular films in the slasher genre such as Halloween and Scream, and is often referenced in the scripts, and that was something that Halloween would become as well. Psycho is a precursor to those films of the 70s and 80s and still is a big influence on films today, and it's crazy to think, watching it now, that while it is shot in black and white, we don't see a lot of blood, we don't really see the knife penetrating the skin, and there's some other things that just don't seem like a big deal to us. They really were a big deal at the time, and they helped to say, goodbye, you're no longer welcome here, the Hays Code, and changed a lot for the 1960s and the future of censorship in film and rating systems as a whole. By 1968, the code didn't really do much. It was time for Hollywood to create a new system. Then came the MPAA, letter ratings that helped parents decide if a film was appropriate for their children. The system has been going strong for years, but has evolved in numerous ways. Subscribe to find out more about censorships and rating systems in the film industry.